So the objectness of the book is itself important. We talk often about books as containers for texts. But as a book historian, I'm a materialist, and I remember that a book is a container and the container itself has meaning.
From the heart of The Ohio State University on the Oval, this is Voices of Excellence from the College of Arts and Sciences, with your host, David Staley. Voices focuses on the innovative work of arts and sciences faculty and staff, with departments as wide-ranging as art, astronomy, chemistry and biochemistry, physics, emergent materials, and mathematics and languages, among many others. The college always has something exciting happening. Join us to find out what's new now.
Joining me today in the ASC Marketing and Communication Studio is Sarah Neville, Associate Professor of English and Theater, Film, and Media Arts, The Ohio State University College of the Arts and Sciences. She is the founder and creative director of Ohio State's Lord Denney's Players, an academic theater company that we're going to learn more about this afternoon. Dr. Neville, welcome to Voices.
Thank you for having me.
Well, before we get to that, I want to start, first of all, with your research. And you define yourself as a book historian. I want to take just a moment to tell us what a book historian is.
That is a big question. A book historian...
We ask the big questions on this podcast.
A book historian is interested in the materiality of the documents that we inherit as historians, the materiality, the thingness of books. So book historians don't just study books, we also study single pieces of paper, we might study literature, but we also, as in my case, study things that are not literature, the textbooks or the informational materials that come down to us through these documentary traditions of the past. So as a book historian, I study how these book objects were made, but I'm really interested in the people who made them, and they made them as part of a craft economy in the 16th century. These printers and the people who funded the printers, the publishers, these were often two jobs, two separate kind of roles in the period, and what they thought they were doing when they invested in making a particular book object. So that's what I do as a book historian.
Books are technologies, aren't they?
They are, and we tend not to think about them as technologies because, and I'm sure you talk about this too, once we've naturalized or normalized what a technology is, we stop thinking about it as a technology. Yeah. We tend to think that technology is just something that is new and novel. But actually, we keep inheriting new technologies, and then we treat them as if they are a normal part of life. But a book was a piece of technology. In the 1st century AD, that book form with pages was a radically new piece of technology. And before that, we were using scrolls. And people had to learn what pages were and why they were advantageous over this sort of continuous, yet you need two hands to use a scroll. But a book you can use one-handed. That's pretty useful. That saves your other finger for putting in the back so that you can flip back and forth between the pages.
The best technology, I would say.
Yeah.
You had mentioned your research, your book there a moment ago, Early Modern Herbals and the Book Trade. Tell us about this book. Tell us what you discovered.
So this project actually came out of my undergraduate research, or rather it came out of a class that I took with the late great professor at the University of Toronto, Ian Lancashire, who was a linguist, and he taught a course in early modern English linguistics because English became what it is now during the early modern period. It was in the 16th century that English started to steal from all of the other European languages and then even from languages outside of Europe. And one of the mechanisms that we did this was by writing down all the words that other languages had and creating these extravagant glossaries or linguistic equivalency dictionaries. And this preceded what we now understand as modern dictionaries. So it was a course on that. And it was in this course that I had been given this large herbal, which was this big 1,500-page textbook that was listing all of these plants, because on the back of the book there was an index that would name the plant in a bunch of different languages, and it was my job to do a little report on this book. And I got completely distracted by how big and weird this book was and started to do more research on the book. And the research that I did sort of suggested that the person who wrote this book was kind of a scoundrel and a rogue, and he'd actually stolen the text of the book, and he wasn't very bright. And I thought, that seems a little weird, but I don't really quite know what to do with it, and it doesn't make me like the book any less. And then when I did my master's degree, I was exposed to the economic history of the book trade and the breadth of the work that was produced in the 16th century that wasn't capital L literature. So if you're a Shakespeare scholar or an English student, you think about literature as being, here's a bunch of poems, here's John Milton, and here's Edmund Spenser, here's William Shakespeare and Christopher Marlowe, and all of these really impressive works of literature. It's the golden age of literature. I 100% agree with that. But what I learned during my master's degree is that's like the 1%. And then there's a book trade of all this 99% of other books that are being printed in the period. And it's those books being bought and sold that are making the money that enable the publishers to say, here's this play called Hamlet. I guess I'm going to see if it's going to sell. And that broke the world open for me. And I was able to start to put my herbal into a different context. And that's when I realized it couldn't have been a book that was authored by that author who said, I write a book in the 1590s and I'm going to bring it to a publisher to publish it. In fact, I came to the conclusion, there's no way that the author of this book was the originator or the prime mover of this book at all. This book was way too expensive for that. It had to have been something else. And I started to do more research and eventually changed the narrative around how we think about that book in particular, but other large illustrated books of natural history, that they're not simply the product of an author who writes one and then goes to find a publisher. In fact, in many cases, in this case for sure, it's the publisher who says, I see a place in the market for a book of this sort. I'm going to find someone who can write a text for me. And I'm going to make this happen. And that changes the script on the way that historians tend to think about these books.
Was that pretty common? Was that a pretty common practice?
It was a common practice for large format books. Often they needed to be produced with an eye to publication, which meant that a publisher had to be on side first. Otherwise, they simply are not going to get printed in the period.
You'd mentioned that the great literature makes up 1% of the books that were produced, and there's this whole ocean of books, including your Herbals book. What sorts of books are we talking about here?
Well, we're talking about a lot of religious books, for one thing. In England, this is the age of the Reformation. There's a lot of doctrine that is getting produced, but it's getting produced not just through official channels, but also like lay people who are trying to write religious treatises that can explain, say, all the plants in the Bible. That's one of the herbals. It's called A Herbal for the Bible. Let me tell you about all the plants of the Bible, and let me explain to you their significance and where you might find them in your landscape. So that's a huge chunk of material. But there's also works that are speculative for the purpose of helping people kind of populate their own home or domestic readership, their domestic libraries. It's not always clear in the first couple decades of printing being established in England at the end of the 15th century and then the beginning of the 16th century. No one is really sure what kind of books people are going to want to buy and sell. And so the printers who are printing at this time, they're throwing a lot of stuff at the wall to see if it sticks. They are publishing a ton of things like ballads, of course, very small pieces of their just single pages of text. Those were popular, very, very popular, but those don't really survive very well to make it easy for us to study them. The more pages that a book has, the more likely it is to survive. The fewer pages, the smaller the book is, the easier it is for that book to kind of get worn to pieces. And so one of the things that I talk about in my book is that the most popular herbal of the period is a very small 16th century herbal that doesn't appear to have a lot of meaningful information in it. It doesn't have pretty pictures. It's small. It's about the size of a hand, an open hand, in a format known as an octavo. And it was humongously popular. It went through like 20 editions in something like 45 years, which makes it one of the most popular books ever in the 16th century.
Why? What explains this?
Part of it is, I think, that people were eager to have a place to jot down their own notations about plants. So the objectness of the book is itself important. So when we think about books, we tend to think of them as being important for the information they contain. We talk often about books as containers for texts. But as a book historian, I'm a materialist, and I remember that a book is a container, and the container itself has meaning. It's the thingness of the book that enables a publisher to sell it. And when a publisher can sell it, they make money. And if they make money selling it, they're going to print it again and again and again. And so it's also the thingness that attracts a reader to a book. They want to have a book. And once they have it, it is now an object where they can record their own observations about plants. We don't have a lot of these left because they often got worn to pieces, used to pieces. They were small, so they weren't likely to survive. But the ones that we do have that I can look at in archives and libraries, they have lots of notes in them, including like recipes, random recipes, just notes about family life, things like that.
Is this like a commonplace book?
They're not commonplace books, but they're places where commonplaces could find a home before, or if they could escape the commonplace book. A commonplace book was often just an empty notebook. But you can kind of see spillover of commonplace traditions within these little volumes. And that's what makes them fun.
So you also describe yourself as an editorial theorist. And I understand the words. I'm not certain I know what an editorial theorist is, though.
So an editorial theorist comes out of my work as I am a Shakespeare editor also. So a textual editor or an editor of Shakespeare helps to decide what words constitutes Shakespeare's writing. So
you get to determine that.
I get to determine that, yes, because we don't have Shakespeare's manuscripts. We don't have his holographs. They did not survive. What we have instead are his printed text or texts that are ascribed to him that were printed. Now, as I was just saying, if a text was printed, it was in a printing shop and it was set into type by a bunch of middle-class craftsmen, people who were literally positioning individual pieces of type one by one in order to copy out a manuscript that happens to be in front of them. So there is a mediation between Shakespeare's manuscript, if that is in fact what the text of Shakespeare's play was being set from, and Shakespeare. And as everybody knows who's played a game of broken telephone, the process of transmission leads to error. And errors creep in as texts were set into type, and even simply as you copy a document from one hand to another. We know this, right? As you can do an experiment with students where you just copy 2 sentences and then have them pass along to another person. And once you do this 3 times, you're going to start to notice how very quickly errors in spelling creep in, and punctuation creep in, lineation starts to shift around. And so a Shakespeare scholar, a Shakespeare textual scholar, attempts to correct for those errors that have crept in over time. But we use our knowledge of the book trades, our knowledge of habits in the printing shop, what kinds of errors were compositors likely to make when they set the type. Sometimes we can identify those compositors and we know that they have habitual changes that as individuals they're just inclined to make, or we know that a particular printing house has a house style that they like to use. And so we use that forensic evidence to help us identify what might be error. And then we can filter that back in to say, okay, well, I know that the word in the printed text is none, but
like the religious figure, none.
No, like none, like not any.
Not any, N-O-N-E.
Like N-O-N-E. But actually, We're pretty sure that that is just the compositor getting what's called eye skip and sort of carrying over an error from seeing the word none 2 lines above and having that affect what they are setting into type. And that actually this should just be 1. So we're going to amend so the text may say none, but actually it really should be 1. And this is a standard practice. All the editions of Shakespeare have been edited in this way and have been for centuries. So a textual scholar does that labor of deciding what the words of Shakespeare happen to be. And then we explain our notes and we make our arguments in the footnotes at the bottom of the edition, of the page of the edition. That's sort of where we spend a lot of our time. And an editorial theorist does that work, but comes up with sort of broader explanations and justifications for how one should make these determinations. What is an acceptable amount of speculation versus what is an unacceptable amount of speculation? So I do that work as well.
So I know that you're writing a new introduction to a new edition of Hamlet, and I assume that your introduction is going to be dealing with these sorts of issues? As I was looking at that, I was thinking, what could be said about Hamlet that hasn't already been said?
That's part of the challenge of writing an introduction to Hamlet, and that's actually one of the approaches that I am taking in writing the introduction. So I did not edit the text. I did not determine the words of the text of this edition of Hamlet. That was done by my colleague on the New Oxford Shakespeare, John Jowett. But I did work on the project that produced this new edition. I just did different plays. But one of the challenges for writing an introduction is that you have to try to invite people into the reading of a text so that they can have the information that they need in order to understand it. That's what an introduction does. Mm-hmm. For Hamlet, the problem is that it is a text with so much cultural baggage that I don't think it's possible to not have familiarity with Hamlet, even if you've never read it. People know the words to be or not to be. They, hold up a skull. They understand that this is somehow part of the text. There's this cultural weight to Hamlet. And so you kind of have to experience Hamlet as a text that comes to you pre-read, pre-digested in some way. It's got a lot of cultural baggage. And so I think the only way to deal with this is to approach that problem of it head on, to recognize that we have afforded this text this immense amount of cultural value that allows it to be deployed as a form of cultural status. And that inheritance is something that makes it difficult for us to really see the text in a new and fresh way. That it's almost like there's this ossified, calcified attitude towards it that makes it challenging to teach or learn about, because you have to strip all of that away so that you can teach people to see things that are really there in the text, because its history, its weight is so heavy.
A moment ago, you said that in editorial theory, one of the things you have to watch for is speculation. Obviously, you have to speculate a little bit. How much speculation is permitted in this field, and how do you know when someone has speculated too much?
Great. That's a really good question. And the way of answering it is I'm going to harken back to a precursor in the field, Fredson Bowers, who was a professor at the University of Virginia, who wrote about the difference between the possible, the probable, and the demonstrable. And demonstrable errors creep into a text in ways that are relatively easy and undebatable. Most people who work in the edition, in creating editions, are going to agree that that's just a turned letter, that N is upside down, and so, or it looks like a U, but it really should be an N, that sort of thing. Those errors are demonstrable. Another version of a demonstrable error is when an iambic pentameter line is split between 2 lines of type because a compositor runs out of measure. So those are fairly straightforward. But what distinguishes one editor for another is the distinction between the possible and the probable. And the possible is exactly what it sounds like. It is possible that a solution to this difficult reading that might seem somewhat garbled could be this. And an editor will propose an emendation. And they often will propose the history of editorial theory is filled with ingenious emendations for what could possibly have been meant in a given circumstance. The response that other critics may have to that is, yes, but can you show that there is a probability that this kind of error occurred? Can you show that in other circumstances, Shakespeare spelled the word that way? So, for example, we know that Shakespeare, for one reason or another, was fond of spelling the word silence with a C, like science, S-C-I, because it creeps up in a variety of printed texts in ways that could not possibly be the result of like compositors having weird habits of spelling or something. It has to be inherited from the manuscripts. And so given that there is a demonstrable history of this spelling showing up in printed texts that lead to it probably being Shakespeare's spelling, that leads some people to conclude that a particular emendation that relies on a spelling of S-C-I to define is probable, right? There is a greater probability of that. So that might lead to a particular kind of emendation. So different editors, as I say, have different thresholds for those changes. And that's where they tend to make their distinctions and often some of their most aggressive arguments in the pages of editorial theory journals.
Well, I introduced you as the creative director of Lord Denney's Players, and you'll have to tell us what is this theater group?
So Lord Denney's Players was founded in 2014, which is the year that I arrived at OSU. I was very fortunate that when I arrived, I inherited a little pot of money that had been given to the English department by an English department donor who wanted to see the English department put on a play. And I knew a little bit about this, and so this was my task was to put on a play to create some community within the English department. And we put on Richard II, The Tragedy of Richard II. This is a Shakespeare play from 1597. This is the play of the usurped King Richard II, whose crown is aggressively removed from him by his cousin Henry Bolingbroke. And this is the event that leads to a century of civil war, essentially. And so this experience was so successful that I was encouraged to keep going. And the donor was very happy and has continued to fund this project. And what it has meant is that every year since, Lord Denney's Players has been able to produce a play of Shakespeare and his contemporaries. This is a company that is designed to help students see some of the intersections between texts of Shakespeare, which, as I've been indicating, have some debates associated with them, and performance, so that we bring these interesting textual questions or textual curiosities to the public stage so that Central Ohio audiences can see them. So we're fortunate in that, unlike a regular theater company, we don't actually have to worry too much about trying to make money with our productions. Our donor is very happy to have students simply participate in this sort of high-impact learning experience where they are getting an opportunity to build a show from the ground up, but also see the way that production can function as a form of research itself and have an impact on some of these larger critical questions that are coming up in Shakespeare scholarship. So in that very first production of Richard II, we took on a pressing critical question about that play, which is that it exists in two forms. This is a play about the usurpation of Richard II, and the kind of central beautiful showpiece of this play, which is in this perfect iambic pentameter verse. It's one of Shakespeare's sort of loveliest plays. There's a scene where King Richard pointedly unkings himself and gives his crown to Bolingbroke. So Bolingbroke has captured him, but Richard is holding out under this position that I have been ordained by God, effectively. I was born into my position. I have a kind of divinity of kingship. And the only person who can unking a king is a king. And so I am going to hold out for this deeply theatrical performance so that everyone at court can see that the only person who can unking me is me. And this is a really important scene in the play. It's the scene that most critics, Shakespeareans, talk about this scene all the time. If you are David Tennant and you're performing this scene at the Royal Shakespeare Company, this is the scene that you want to play. And it's amazing. Only that scene only made it into print in 1608. In the first editions, the first 3 editions printed in 1597, and then after that, that scene wasn't there. The scene didn't exist. And so the question that scholars have been preoccupied with is this a scene that was censored because it's so profoundly affecting and potentially dangerous at the end of Queen Elizabeth's reign? Nobody knows who's going to take over for her. Are we going to get plunged back into war? We don't want to see an image, right? Was there censorship on the stage? Was there censorship for the press that's prevented this from being performed at all? That's one argument. But the other argument is, no, Shakespeare just wrote that scene later and it got inserted after the fact. But because the performance history of the play sort of demands that this wonderfully effective, beautiful scene is necessarily a part of the play, no one had ever seen the play be performed without it. So we performed the play 2 ways.
Oh,
the first weekend without the scene, and then the second weekend we added it in. And what we were able to show, and what scholars who came to see the play, because a number of people were really interested in it, what they were able to see is that the play changes so that it's not just this play about the performance of kingship. It's also a play that concludes with some questions about paternity, because with the absence of this scene, you start to see a scene with a relatively under-acknowledged character, and his son now takes much greater prominence at the ending of the play because it's the big showpiece scene, which it isn't when there's a much more impressive single scene in front of it. And so that became kind of the cornerstone of what Lord Denney's players started to do. We started to use our company as a means to explore textual questions in performance. What sorts of critical questions did editorial theory, did Shakespeare scholarship raise about Shakespeare's plays that exist in multiple versions? And how could we use our really fortunate position to showcase some of those?
The student performers, are they theater majors? Are they English majors?
They're from all over the campus. We have had students from over 50 majors participate in our productions since we started. And I'm really, really proud of that. And every year we get folks from more places show up.
Where are these performances held?
We perform in the public theaters of Columbus. We perform often in the Columbus Performing Arts Center. We will be performing at Mad Lab Theater also.
So you already talked a bit about this. You talked about the course that you took at the University of Toronto. That was the moment that you knew you wanted to be a book scholar or a book historian. So why are you, why that course? Why are you a book historian and say, I don't know, a physicist or a sociologist or something? How did you know that this was the subject?
I think it came about because I saw a system that underlay the stuff that I loved. And so I loved the literature, and that hasn't changed at all. I became fascinated as an undergraduate with the literature of the 16th century, with lyrical poetry, and particularly with romance and the fairy queen and the stories of legend within that. And drama captivated me right from the start. I loved all of that. But what really took over for me when I started to learn about the book trade was that I started to see how these pieces fit together within an economy that helped to explain to me why they were able to survive. And it was almost like getting a look through a telescope at the broader cosmos, right? Must have felt for those initial astronomers. That's sort of what I felt like. There was a moment where I learned about the short title catalog of books published in England and in English in the 16th century. And this is just it's a 3-volume list of books. It's just an enumerative book list. It's a gigantic bibliography, but it's a list of everything that was printed since the beginning of printing in England until the start of the Civil War in 1640. So from 1473 to 1640. And I couldn't get enough of pouring through this book. And I sort of realized that everything I might want to figure out about how people read in the past, in the century that I'm interested in, can be answered by looking at this. This is the list. This is my data set. This is the world. And there was nothing quite like it after that. All of the things that I want to do are an example of a specific text, a specific book, but I never lose sight of this larger textual ecology of which these books are a part.
So tell us what's next. What are you working on now?
Well, I'm working on this introduction to Hamlet and trying very hard not to psych myself out about it. It's coming along. I'm also at work on a new edition of the second part of Henry VI, which is the first play that Shakespeare wrote, or quite possibly the first play that Shakespeare wrote when he arrived in London in the early 1590s. He was one of a group of people who were working on a play about the unsuccessful King Henry VI. And it's a weird play because even though it's the second part, we now call it the second part, it was actually the first part of what had been conceived of as a 2-part play. And those 2 plays were so successful that they very quickly wrote a prequel that became part 1. So sorting out the narrative history of the events of these plays can be challenging, but also the chronology in which they were written can be challenging. So that's going to take me the next couple of years.
Sarah Neville, thank you.
Thank you.
Voices of Excellence is produced and recorded at The Ohio State University College of Arts and Sciences Marketing and Communications Studio. More information about the podcast and our guests can be found at go.osu.edu/voices. Voices of Excellence is produced by Doug Dengler. I'm Jen Farmer.